So in the morning, in this morning's guided meditation, we began a bit more explicitly introducing several of the prominent insight themes, especially in the early Buddhist teachings, but we see as runs throughout. And of course, these insight themes are not claimed to be Buddhist, but more or less just observations and deeper understanding of our experience, and certain ways of discerning experience that tend to highlight how our relationship to it is in some way related to our suffering, or our grasping, our suffering, our unawareness of what we're experiencing, but also what's related to our non-freedom, our non-happiness, you see, in this more positivity sense, or what leads to more freedom, more liberation, more genuine happiness. So, as mentioned, if some of us are just feeling much more in a meditation space, to be doing tranquility meditation or peaceful meditation, or we're not in the mood for insight, or that's just not our character, or we're oozing with devotion, or want to be doing saturating in loving kindness and compassion, and that's what's working for us here, that is just fine. And much of these can be combined, as we're probably already aware ourselves, as more experienced practitioners, or we're certainly presenting them that way, how this, well, again, if one is sort of unification minded, one will begin to see how beginning to appreciate more what tends to unify things, unify our experience, unify our path, unify roots of the path, like that. So we're seeing that everything that's about releasing grasping, or getting insights to alleviate suffering, has this inherent intentionality of the Dharma in it, or liberation in it, to be alleviating suffering and optimizing well-being, like that. So yeah, but if one is in just more of a space to want to focus on one particular thing or another, that's just fine. But hopefully the integrated natures of these insights will be ever more revealing themselves as nature, teaching the nature of nature to us. So these are, of course, three very universal wisdom themes here. What we were calling the desireless, that is somewhat unique way they're presented, these three doorways to liberation of desirelessness, or through the sort of the suffering, or the the freedom characteristic there. I'm using a bit poetic license to phrase it that way, but often the noble truth of suffering will get presented alongside with the noble truth of liberation, which is the cessation of suffering, that's there in the third noble truth. So depending on our character type, negativity bias, positivity bias, we might see it in that way. Or as some would, lions roar from their own experience. Indeed, the cessation of suffering does bring with it all the positivity, like that. Or maybe, vice versa as well. But this doorway, the doors to the deathless, or these kind of gateways to the Dharma, they could be, one could be more relevant to us more than another, depending on our character type. I mean, there's all kinds of character typology in the ancient scriptures, where a faith character will incline more to this characteristic or that, like anicca, impermanence, for example, or wisdom character. By the way, all practitioners are sort of typologied into two major character types. You're either a wisdom character or a faith character. But that's actually on a spectrum. So we'll see what we all have faith and wisdom, but some of us have more of one than the other. So that will be influencing how our spiritual faculties develop, our indriya, and what our strengths are, what our more weaknesses are, and when it comes time to balance those out, go to the next level. So whichever characteristic, these are often called the three characteristics, the T lakkhana, just characteristics of conditioned phenomena, they say that, or experience in a more general term about how things are impermanent, they're changeable. They arise, they're subject to pass away. And we'll notice that a dependent origination isn't exactly an explicit characteristic, but it certainly is included as, fundamental to the characteristics. It's called the Dhamma Titanyana, actually, the stability of things. And it is said to be the heart of the Buddha's awakening insight at a sort of liberating description or understanding of our conditioned phenomena or conditioned experience, dependent origination. So it's hard to gauge how familiar we are with all of that. But dependent origination will be there in everything, like this letting go or non-grasping. Well, that's independent origination. The thing about impermanence and conditionality, well, that's in there in dependent origination. The thing about non-self identity, that's in there. Dependent origination. So dependent origination or paticca samuppada, or this kind of conditionality, when this is, this comes to be. When this is not, that is not. Ida paccayata, when that one can, if one's more sort of not just philosophically minded, but sort of scientifically minded, to want to really discern some of the more subtle cause and effect happening, or conditionality of, say, impermanence or selflessness, non-self, or emptiness, or suffering, unsatisfactoriness. So we've been, anytime we're discussing insight, it's quite likely related to these three in one way or another. And some traditions or later traditions that are really attempting to put the wisdom right up front. In fact, some of them will even go so far as to say, take the fruit as the path, where you actually are looking for sort of dimensions of non-grasping which are already present. Like we've definitely been including this, but I'm sort of restraining my how emphatic to be about that. But like awareness itself doesn't grasp. It lets everything come and go. So that's one brilliance of the awareness practices that are looking to have this cessation of becoming, is that awareness itself is not grasping. And that can be a very, very direct way to get a gateway in, and almost taking the fruit of the path. If you were to take the sort of enlightened mind of the Arahant, or Chitta, which is freed of the Arahant or the Buddha, you wouldn't see grasping there. I mean, that's pretty clear and universally agreed upon across the Buddhist traditions. And if you practice a little bit, you'll see, yeah, you don't need to grasp. You don't need to grasp to think, to act, or to feel like the Buddha. Okay, the Buddha is, okay, agree, free from grasping and all that, but there's still a functioning, 5 aggregates manifestation there, even though the Buddha, when confronted, would say, no, a Buddha is not these 5 aggregates and can not be reckoned herein. So some of us will flag objections to that, saying, oh, the Buddha is, this person walking around who's liberated. No, the Buddha said explicitly not. The Buddha has gone beyond reckoning in terms of the aggregates And also the Buddha said that dimension of reality or realization cannot be understood by the mind or cannot be fully comprehended by those who are at even a lesser stage of realization, although there'll be some overlap. So I am kind of squeezing in things that I would want to include along the way. So sometimes it sounds random, but they are definitely in response to things that we feel definitely need to be included in the discussion. So yes, so this presentation of insight themes or the three characteristics. Another just brief note on that. This is how we're introduced to it in the Thai forest tradition. They call it sati panya every time. Sati is mindfulness, panya is wisdom. We're like breastfed on that, or spoon-fed on that. We grow up on saying sati panya, sati panya. You have that all the time. They emphasize these three most of the 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. Presumably, if you're a monastic, they say your conduct and livelihood have been purified long ago. That means you're ready for this next step of really focusing on your bhavana, your meditation. It's just a little, well, so we get this mindfulness and wisdom, and you carry that all the time, and that's your right effort to always be mindful, aware. Everything else is included in that, basically. So this sati panya, we will have our insight theme of contemplation. The Thai forest tradition, it's very common to start with the body, 3 characteristics of the body, because it is so teaching the 3 characteristics all the time. In the Thai tradition, they call this the Maha Acharya, the great Ajahn. If you donate your body to a monastery, they'll prepare the skeleton and they'll put a little name tag at the bottom that says the Maha Acharya, the great Ajahn, donated by so-and-so. And it's a skeleton there. And we use that just to contemplate. I mean, look, we've got what, 10 or 11 skeletons here in the room. We grow up contemplating the 3 characteristics of the body because it is so evident. Its conditionality, its impermanent nature, it's that it is, prone to pain and suffering, and its high maintenance and all that. And it might not be the kind of solid sense of self that we tend to habitually regard it as. So they'll say, be keeping your mindfulness and wisdom all the time, your sati panya. We will have some insight theme of contemplation going. They say anicca, impermanence, is the universal gateway because everything is saying I'm impermanent. If we, without going into the science of it, just our sense experience, we can just see everything is impermanent. And it's a very universal way in to begin to contemplate one's experience, be paying more attention to it, and see how we're grasping in certain ways, which is not in harmony with the nature of the way things are. That point cannot be overemphasized, that along with our insight theme, this is how it always is being linked to the 4 Noble Truths. We want to see how am I interpreting and relating to my experience in a way which is perpetuating my suffering, or in a way which is perpetuating my non-freedom, or is in somehow I'm not in harmony with the nature of the way things are. They're impermanent. I'm grasping at them not to change, not to arise and pass away according to causes and conditions or nature. So they say we get rope burn when we're grasping like that. So one's always got that in mind. I mean, this 4 Noble Truths is also said to be a hallmark feature of the Buddhist teachings because if they don't liberate, they're not the Buddhist teachings, frankly, or at least the heart, the essence of the Buddhist teaching. So the impermanence, how is that relevant? How is that, contributing to grasping in my life or my day-to-day suffering like that? So same with this sense of self. That can show up a little bit deeper, but I've spoken,
I just want to come back to what you said a little bit earlier about insight, aside like many of us come from a Vipassana tradition, as it's called, but the word Vipassana as a word for a tradition or a technique, that's actually also only something from maybe the last 100 years or so. The word was never used in that way in Buddhist texts. It basically just means clear seeing, or we can call it insight. And you cannot have like these insights without also having some calmness in the mind. So it doesn't need to be extremely calm, but the more calm you are, the better insights you get, and they just come up. You can't just make them come up so much in that sense. But and with that is also love and kindness in there, because mindfulness and love and kindness, they go with that. You have to have a certain form of mindfulness to be able to get these insights. And some of you probably know the story that I always or quite often talk about, that I have from Ajahn Brahm, I must admit, about Mr. Samatha and Mrs. Vipassana and Metta the dog. And so Samatha is word for the sort of this calmness of the mind, and Vipassana is the insight. And they go for a walk up the mountain. And sometimes one is ahead, and sometimes another runs ahead. Sometimes the dog runs ahead, and it's not just that you need one, isn't it? One technique or something, and that you can see them loose from each other. They all come at the top, sort of around the same time. And then you can enjoy the beautiful view from there and the clarity that brings. But what that means to say is that you cannot really see them loose from each other. They're all like sort of aspects of the same thing. And so that's one thing I wanted to, especially within the Vipassana traditions, it's quite often sort of split as like, oh, you do this samatha now, and you do Vipassana then. But it doesn't quite work that way. You need to have like all of it together. And one important aspect of that is this sort of bare awareness of everything that's going on with a calm mind. And doesn't mean that you should be, for the non-native speakers here, it doesn't mean being aware of bears. It's this basically means just awareness. And for me, that always means a little bit like stepping a little bit outside of yourself, sort of like as if you're sort of looking at yourself and your own surroundings and everything that's happening to you from a little bit of a third perspective from behind it, is looking at this being that we call you, this being breathing, this being doing things. And when you have a little bit of that outside perspective, you can also see that the thoughts start to appease, the mind starts to become more calm, and it's just taking everything in and just be knowing. Be there, knowing what's going on, what is happening. And from that perspective, at some point, insights start to come up. And of course, there's the three insight themes that are important. Being into the nature of that everything's changing, anicca, that everything is, that there's suffering. I think we can all see that. And but also quite often we don't see how deep that suffering goes and what actually is suffering. We see we see the suffering in the world. When we have a pain, we see that we have suffering, but there's also far more to that. And to really see that, we have to take a little bit of this step back and really observe with this inquisitive mind, with not wanting to get rid of things that feel a little bit uncomfortable, but to really understand, like, hey, something feels uncomfortable there. What's really happening? Let's stay with this for a little moment, and is like a scientist observing, like, what's happening here? What is this? And that's when insights start to come up, and we get deeper and deeper into what the nature of all things. So it basically means, yes, everything is changing. That feeling of uncomfortableness or whatever it is, it will change. It won't stay forever. And even if somebody has like chronic pains that are there all the time, they will also start to see that there are like sometimes it's a little bit more and sometimes a little bit less. It's also not always the same. It's also changing. So you can see in everything that's happening that these very subtle changes that are constantly happening. And that will give you some insights like, oh yes, this too changes. And this too is some form of suffering, even though I didn't see it that way because it was less suffering than some other form of suffering I experienced. And then at the ultimate, or maybe that's not the right wording, but then we also start to see like where this sense of self is, and where that sense of self comes up, and that all these theory are very much linked together. If you have some kind of suffering, there is a sense of self there. So, and the more we learn to see that and get these insights in this how this whole mind body structure works in that way, slowly our meditation practice also starts to deepen and deepen and deepen until we come to much more deeper stages of meditation as well. Ajahn also talks about the 5 aggregates, groups that Buddha used to describe. These are just forms to describe like how the mind body structure works. And for each of these groups, we can see it's like, okay, where is this sense of self? Where is the suffering? Where is it changing? And the body is the first one. And if you think like, oh, I've already done away with that, I have no more clinging to the body. I can see it's not self. Wait till you're in a life and death situation, and then see if you still say that. It goes very, very deep, this clinging to our body. So that's why there's so much emphasis on exactly this group in the Thai forest tradition, but also in other traditions, to look at every aspect of this body and see what is really there and where do I really cling to. So that's why we also do things like skeleton meditations, which I very much like. And in the last some months ago, Elizabeth had organized a retreat together with some other people in Vienna, where we really focused on exactly these aspects of of what this body is, and then describing it in the way of what in Indian philosophy is called the 4 elements, or the 4 great elements. Because like at that time they didn't have the knowledge of like molecules and all these kind of things, or how we describe things today. And even for those of you who know a little bit about it, the Bohr module of molecules is not accurate either. But what I did in ancient India is we divide that in 4 great elements. So earth, water, wind, and fire. And it doesn't mean that you put these things together and you have a body. Of course, it doesn't work that way. These are more like looking at the qualities of these things. So if you have, like, for instance, earth, there's a quality of hardness, of heaviness, and you can find that in your body as well. So that's very, very short. I don't want to go too much into these things. But we can of course see it's like water. Well, our body is 80% water, and there's all kinds of fluids in our body, so we can look at it that way. Fire, of course, there's temperature differences. Winds, well, the air that we breathe, for instance, the winds in our intestines, or the air in our intestines, all these kind of things, they're part of that. So we can see like, oh yeah, that's where all these elements come together. So investigating that on spending really some time investigating that on a very deeper level, then begin to and staying with that, especially that to stay with, for instance, what is hardness? Where do I find hardness? Staying with that for weeks and weeks and whatever, and just begin to really see it's like what is really going on there, and that all that is all constantly changing as well. and yeah, that it is in itself also suffering on a very subtle level. So that's the first group, and then we have like other groups like the Buddha, by the way, described like the body as foam on the river Ganges. So yeah, you can see it's like, well, there's this foam. We have this on the river here as well. Yeah, there's nothing there really. It's just bubbles. If you take it in your hand, it just disappears. It's not nothing. And the second group is group of feelings, and especially Dhamma tradition is focusing a lot on that. But they're focusing mostly on feelings in the body, but there's also the mental feelings. So it's basically the aspect of each experience that is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So when you see something, you like it, oh, there's a pleasant feeling. So the things like that is also part of that. And the Buddha described that as a drop in a puddle. So it's there one moment, the next moment it's gone. And you might say like, oh yeah, my pain or my, that's gone for, that stays for God knows how long, and that's not just a drop in a puddle. Well, if you really start to investigate it, you see it constantly comes and goes. It's very fast. So it's not a constant thing. It's also changing. It's not solid in that sense. And then the sanya is often translated as perception, also as memory. And the Buddha described that as a mirage in the desert. So you can see, like, you see something and it looks really real. It looks like this oasis with all the palm trees and whatever, and it's not there. This is our perception. We create a lot of things, and we'll come back to that probably in the next few days as well, a bit more. Well, because I've always found it a very, very interesting point, is to look at what is our perception really, what are our memories, how does this whole thing work, how do they all work together? But I won't go into that now. And the next one is Sankhara, and that's notoriously difficult to translate. Quite often as mental formations, but that probably also doesn't say very much the first time you hear that. And like, okay, what does that mean? A large part of that is that thing that wants to do things, it wants to have things, that wanting, this will of wanting to change things, and that's a very important point, because that's also messing with our meditation quite often. Like, we want our meditation to be nice and soft and smooth and all going very well, and then it doesn't go that way and you get upset about it or whatever. And when you really start looking into it, it's like every time you want something, your mind goes out. You can't stay still at this moment in time in the meditation. And then there's a subtle wanting there, something different, not wanting to be in this present moment right now. So that's an interesting one also to study as well. And the last one is, I think we'll go into that much more later on as well. It's the consciousnesses, so of the mind. So every time you see, hear, or taste, smell, or whatever, anything, you're conscious of that, basically. So, but I won't go so much into that, I find, because that goes a bit too deep now, and so pass on the word to Ajahn Santamano.
So yeah, I thought maybe to start off with, just to reflect briefly on the four noble truths, and maybe mention different origination, so depending on where this goes. The the first noble truth that there is suffering, or maybe not even suffering, but that's a sort of dissatisfactoriness in whatever we may experience. So even if things are perfect, one is happy, so external circumstances are comfortable, maybe there's that sort of background anxiety of what if this goes away, or that dependence on things being a particular way, either internally or externally. So also suffering dukkha in that sort of wider sense, not always just as sort of intense pain or suffering, emotional, physical, etc. So that characteristic of experiencing, of existing, that dissatisfactoriness as part of ordinary experience. And then the second noble truth is the origin of suffering, the tanha, or craving or desire, that and the three. These were yesterday the questions. So then I think there was question bhava, tanha, the desire to become, so sense desire, kama tanha, sense desire, bhava tanha, desire to become either in the present or the future, and vibhava tanha, desire to get rid of, or literally not become. And then the third noble truth is letting go of the end cessation of suffering, and that comes when one is able to let go or abandon that craving. That is the sort of basis upon which that experience of dissatisfactoriness arises. And then the fourth is the path, the eightfold path, what we can actually do in our, what we actually practice in order to allow that letting go to happen. So then, yeah, maybe a bit more at the second noble truth, the sort of craving, that tanha, the base, say for example, kama tanha, that's, or sense desire, that's, it's, I suppose, fairly easy to understand, at least on an intellectual level, that if our happiness is dependent on pleasant experiences through the senses, experiencing pleasant sounds, pleasant taste, sounds, touch, etc., then inevitably suffering would follow, because one would not be able to create the perfect or always maintain the perfect external conditions, whereby one would only experience pleasant experiences through the senses, and inevitably there would be some dissonance, something that's not quite right, even if that's so if one is able to craft the perfect conditions, something in the mind might find fault, even if it's like the work of some great artist, and they spend many long time perfecting a particular piece of art, and maybe someone comes along and their aesthetic sense isn't satisfied, they see something wrong, or someone playing a piece of music and they may be very skilled and spend maybe like many hours of the day practicing, and then they're doing a performance, and maybe someone finds some fault with how they execute a particular passage or how they interpret, etc., etc. So many subtle, more and more subtle levels, that whole world of the senses, and so if one approaches the world seeking happiness, seeking contentment, or true satisfaction just in the world of the senses, then one can, at least on an intellectual level, see that maybe that might not be the best or most reliable way to seek happiness. So and again, it's not to deny enjoyment from beauty or pleasant enjoyment of pleasant experiences. But again, like William Blake Madden was mentioning, it's that it's not with that sense of attachment. If one is able to just appreciate, or similar, an image I like for the knowing is like a mirror. So the mirror, it just reflects whatever is in front of it. If it's pointing this way, then it reflects what's here. And then if we turn it this way, then it forgets what is there, and it just reflects what is before it here. But our mind, we tend to sort of cling to things. There's some pleasant experience, and it feels nice. So then we want more of it. So then there's that clinging. So there's that tanha or craving for an object. Maybe this clock, I really like it. I just want it for myself. Then I pick it up and cling to it. And then maybe when it's time for meditation, when the world wants to look at the clock, and I keep holding it because I want it myself. So then that's sort of, and then inevitably some sort of suffering can follow from that. And then bhava tanha, the desire to become, or desire. I believe the question was that I suppose it can also be interpreted as in the present desire to be something, desire to exist, I suppose, here and now, and then all sorts of ideas one might have of, oh, I'm an unenlightened being, so I must practice really hard so I can become enlightened in the future. Or one hears of some sort of meditation state, and that sounds very nice. So then I want to have that particular attainment or meditation state, or one can say, oh, on a more ordinary level, I want to become famous, I want to become this or that, or something one perceives oneself as not being, and then the desire, the craving to become that. And then the vibhava tanha, that one I find very useful to contemplate, because it manifests so often in our ordinary experience, but we don't tend to give so much importance to it, or we may not notice it so often. So on a more existential level, that desire, literally it means desire to not become. So that sort of tiredness with existence, this wishing to not feel, to not experience, to and it's just too much, and just desire for non-existence. So on a, I suppose more existential level, but on a more ordinary level, just the little annoyances that we might experience, that the way we feel, our mood at a particular time, the various thoughts, the various emotions that might arise that we might judge as sort of ugly or unacceptable. Or it's like, oh, I don't want to feel this, don't want to be like this, I don't want to, I want to get rid of this. It's like that's sort of turning away from whatever we may be experiencing. And then often that can lead to us repressing certain, that's certain, almost like a lack of honesty with oneself, wishing, oh, I'm like a good Buddhist, I shouldn't feel like this, or I'm a spiritual person, I practice, and why am I being so petty, or why am I feeling this or that, etc., and then the desire to get rid of it. But then that too is like such a fuel for suffering. Like the image they use is like a fire is burning, and then if we keep adding more fuel to the fire, then it keeps going. But if we stop adding the fuel, so it's still uncomfortable while there's still fuel there. So it's like that's where the patient endurance comes in. And when we hear something like patient, like the Uvada Pratimukha, one of the sayings of the Buddha, that patient endurance is the highest austerity. It burns up the defilements. So when we hear something like that, we can easily think, okay, that just means I must be strong. I must just grit my teeth and just bear with it. But better way of describing patient endurance, it was willingness to peacefully coexist with that which is difficult to bear. So then that. Because that awareness, consciousness has the capacity to receive everything. And so when the fire or the uncomfortable experience is there, so when that, but if we are able to stop adding more fuel, more upadana, more clinging, clinging, then once the fuel that's there, once that burns up, then it subsides in its own time. So again, that thing of noticing cessation, allowing things to come to an end. Usually we tend to sort of, by fighting with them, we tend to give them more energy. By fighting with them through form of point of view of vibhavatan. Yeah, these are, didn't get to dependent origination, but yeah, these are a few things that came to me.
Yes, very interesting points. One of special interest, yes, with the Four Noble Truths, like that, we notice this first noble truth of suffering that the Buddha does sort of in the elaboration of it, in the formula, it does sort of go from more objective to more subjective forms of suffering. So it starts out with some of the most general or objective experience, universal experiences of suffering, like, illness, aging, and death, for example. But then it quickly goes into separation from the light, association with the disliked, not attaining one's wishes. You see, very immediately, there's this subjective aspect to it, where if the I don't like it, or the I don't want it, or I'm disappointed isn't there, it's somehow not the same suffering. So it's not the objective situation in itself, it's our relationship to it, of not wanting it, not liking it. This has very, very broad implications. For example, this thing about, things are suffering because they're impermanent. Well, wait a minute here. Even in this, lovely William Blake poem, Kissing the Joy as It Flies, as new agey as that might sound, but just because things are impermanent, do they have to be suffering? Or is it when I'm grasping at them not to change that they become suffering? See, that cannot be left out of the discussion, and it's very explicit there in the Four Noble Truths. So for us to just, and it really does have to do with a shift of blaming things for our dukkha, or taking responsibility for them, or just reframing it as a way as, there's something I'm not understanding here, not having insight into regarding my experience or interpretation of my experience, which is perpetuating some dysfunctional relationship to it, like expecting it not to change when it doesn't, or it's not meeting my agenda to satisfy my wishes, etc. Because that will be showing up more subtle features of the relationship, like the whole me and mine business that's happening. This mine appropriating experience as mine, this me, the one who is the wanting and not wanting. So the Buddha will say things like, I teach the Dhamma to the one who feels, to go straight to that sort of raw subjectivity where the wanting and not wanting is coming from, and to make sure we're including that explicitly in the more subjective understanding of, like, say, the Four Noble Truths. So that's amazing. I mean, that's why we'll hear a slogan like, changing the attitude changes circumstances. And we all know there's ways in which that can be deceptive, self-deceptive, bypassing a form of denial as well. Or like we don't know if you have the Aesop's fables here. We grew up with them as children in America, and I think they're German. But there's the fable of the fox and the sour grapes, where the fox sees some juicy grapes hanging on a vine, just like grow around here, and it jumps to try to reach them, but it can't, however much it may try. And so in order to placate the sense of dejection or disappointment, the fox simply says, clever fox, they're sour anyway. They're probably sour anyway. And then it can go on its way. So that is a very apt simile of how reframing can also be a form of self-deception. So we just keep that in mind, however we are able to get some clarity and discernment into it, the subjectivity of our experience. Because again, taking the example of an arahant or a Buddha, well, impermanent, and this does depend on which sort of school of Buddhism you're in agreement with, but in certain schools, they feel that once your ignorance regarding, selfhood, regarding experience is resolved, then it's just not suffering anymore. There's no more suffering. A Buddha, an Arahant, by definition, they're like free from suffering. So it's not manifestation in itself that's the problem. It's more the relationship to it. And some traditions will really follow up on that. As Ajahn mentioned, this thing about going to either extreme of solidification or substantiating, like existence, or annihilation. This is sort of one extreme example of bhava tanha or vibhava tanha, the tendency to want to annihilate. Well, one skillful means of like presenting the three characteristics here in this way, notice how when we are contemplating impermanence, we have this vantage point of the now. So there's something about the now which asserts a positive dimension of actuality that we just cannot deny. So while everything might be impermanent, that's all from the vantage point of the now. And some deeper, either samadhi, as I mentioned, there were just many points to riff off here. But this thing about the unification of our samatha and vipassana, or our samadhi and our panya, that is a big theme in the later wisdom traditions, because every insight does have a samadhi component to it, even if it is this continuity of mindfulness. So what we will be noticing more and more, that is, we are always in this singular dimension of the now. And the knowing absolutely cannot get out of it, because that's its nature. So that becomes a refuge. The thing about suffering, well, yeah, many do translate it as dissatisfactory or discontent. There's some discontentment always driving us away from realizing or recognizing the here and now and what it has to offer. So that can be just another thing that becomes very obvious when one does, either through samadhi or through wisdom, insight, begin to be able to resolve more what the now actually is. And frankly, one will have to step out of the mind to do that. The best the mind can do is a present moment that's in a series of, flicker fuse kind of mind moments of attention like that. It's a whole different dimension to step into the knowing. And so that's a sort of positivity aspect of impermanence. That's why it's presented this way. Change and impermanence alongside with the now. And the same with the non-self business or the emptiness, to just balance out the tendency to want to deconstruct everything and turn it into nothing or empty. There's the dimension of the knowing, or that knowing which is actually getting the insight into the Dhamma. The Pali Geek term is vipassana, anuvipassana. So it's the vipassana, it's the meditator, it's the vipassana doing vipassana meditation on the meditator itself. That made sense. Wasn't the most elegant delivery. But we get the point. If you're meditating on the meditator, you will start to see that's happening in the knowing, or in the jnana, we were calling it yesterday, the knowing of emptiness, the knowing of non-self. You just cannot deny the knowing. But it will see the thinking from a different perspective of the knowing. And all the non-self and emptiness is going to show up in that space of the knowing. So that helps to thwart this annihilationist tendency, or the vibhava tanha, to want to negate everything or deconstruct everything from the point of view of the mind. This is one of the reoccurrent limitation themes of Buddhist philosophical traditions, is they really have a difficulty getting out of the mind and the thinking and the loop of sankhara, just to not see itself as a sankhara for what it is, and be able to have that non-identification, not clinging with sankhara. Sankhara, this mental formations, that is the very root of the I-making and the mind-making in the dependent origination, which is a little more of a sophisticated discussion that we'll get into as we explore dependent origination and non-self. So I did hear an interesting comment from a very senior New Zealand monk. Once we were off in the jungle, our Dao jungle hermitage on the Burmese border, and we were spending a rains retreat together. He's very senior and been living in Sri Lanka for a long time. And he said, most Buddhists fall into one of these two, either the eternalists or the annihilationists, the nihilists. And that's a classic Buddhist philosophical distinction. And also the famous discourse called the Kachana Gota, where the Buddha gave this famous discourse about the world generally is infatuated with the two views of it exists or it does not exist. That's why we'll see this kind of either or prevalence everywhere. It either exists or it doesn't exist. And Buddhists will tend to fall into one of those two. You get the more eternalist of a substantial existence version of a Buddhist and the more annihilationist, emptiness version of a Buddhist. Sometimes that will have to do with our temperament. But this is one skillful means of how to, and the discourse goes on to say, yes, one does not, one sees those are both like sankhara activities to be asserting the existence or the non-existence of things. And so there's a way to step out of that dependent origination cycle with ignorance as a condition, mental formations. There's a way to step out of that. But one skillful means to approach it is to have a sort of positivity aspect. So the positivity aspect of the knowing, which is knowing non-self or knowing emptiness or knowing the realization of Dharma, that helps to balance out this annihilationist nothingness, emptiness aspect of the view or of the equation. And also having the sort of the emptiness or the non-self or aspect helps to balance out the substantiation or solidification of things aspect of the view. So these two often will get included together. Sort of the pure subjectivity of that which is knowing the Dhamma. And frankly, the Buddha did say that, like when you look into the Buddha's experience or an Arahant, you're not going to see the same sense of self there that like we might have, where we are actually clinging to it or convinced of it as a me and a mine and acting from that. But there also there won't just be nothing there in the sense of nothing. Okay, maybe I'm speaking beyond my my means here, speculating about what's inside the Buddha and the Arahant Chittas, but hopefully we get the point there. Okay, so as we round up our talk here, we've been sort of introducing explicitly this topic of insight, or how we're unifying our insight with our meditation, our samatha meditation practice, and these three prominent themes, but they very much include the whole of the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, the Brahma Viharas, the loving kindness meditations, and dependent origination here. And so as we're interested in the following days of the retreat, we can really begin to explore and go deeper into these as meditations in themselves, or mindfulness and wisdom, or even wisdom samadhi, we call it. And we're able to keep an insight theme as our samadhi object. Really go deeper into it. Okay. So we wish all the retreat yogis fruitful practice. Okay, we have an hour for walking meditation before the meal. Well, we can explore keeping a theme of insight with us, whether we're walking or doing activities or meal preparation, etc. We do begin interviews today, and there are a few already signed up. We did think that for now there's two signed up, and maybe we could shift that to the next hour slot, just so we can include that with like the 4 to 5 meditation session. So maybe we'll meet at 3 instead here. Okay, right out front here by the drive at the front gate. Throw down the flag at the monastery gate.
Okay, I didn't quite get to what you want to do now, because there's 3 people signed up. And what
for really?
Is that just for today, or is that for?
Oh well, we were just thinking that because it's not super cold outside, and we need to come inside to warm up. We'll just sort of group the activities together. It's a little bit more convenient for me just to have a longer lunch break, for example. And since I think there's only 2 signed up for me, Jam and Elizabeth. So that was from 2 to 3, but maybe we'll just shift it from 3 to 4. So from 3 to 3:30 out at the monastery gate, and Elizabeth at 3:30 to 4 out at the monastery gate. And we can just go for a little half-hour walk interview.
And Handir, if we also meet at 3 o'clock, but it's only for today then.
Oh, well, I mean, if there's only
Yeah.
2 interviews, then we can just shift it there, and that gives us a little more space with the lunchtime.
Okay.
And Ajahn Santamana is also shifting the interview a little bit later. Okay, sound good? Okay, thank you so much.